おはようございます。KGRI、ウェビナーにこのアクセスしていただいてありがとうございます。私、慶応義塾大学総合政策学部で教員をやっております中山と申します。で今日はトランプ後のアメリカ外交、東アジアへの含意ということで、こうしてウェビナーを開催させていただきますが、ちょうどいいタイミングでといいますか、バイデン政権が誕生して1週間強ということになるかと思いますけども、3人のスピーカーと1人の、コメンテーターをお招きして、1時間このウェビナーを実施したいと思います。で最初にスピーカーのも紹介を話す順番にさせていただきますが、最初のスピーカーは、皆さんもよくご存知で説明する必要もないかとは思うんですけども、アーミテージインターナショナル会長のリチャード・アーミテージさん、国務副長官を務められて、他に国防省でも要職を歴任されて、慶応義塾大学の名誉博士でもあられます。次いで、ウッドロー・ウィルソンセンター、私もサバティカルでそこにお邪魔させていただいたんですけども、ウッドロー・ウィルソンセンターのアジアプログラムのディレクターを務められているエイブラハム・デンマークさんで、彼は最近アジアの世紀におけるアメリカの戦略っていう新潮を出されて、まだ翻訳はないようですけども、ぜひ翻訳が出るといいなとも思ってるんですけども、を書かれたアジア2の、方です。で3人目はザック・クーパーさんで、アメリカン・エンタープライズ・インスティテュート研究所というワシントンの大手の研究所で研究員をされていて、で我々はザックが AEI に移られる前に戦略国際問題研究所にいて、その時から日本と関係の深いプロジェクトをいろいろ運営されていて、日本でもよく知られた東アジア2日本2であります。で最後にこのお三方のこの話を受けてですね、ぜひこの話を展開していって、いただきたいということで、討論者として、私の同僚、慶応義塾大学総合政策学部教授の神保健先生にもご登壇することをお願いしております。神保先生は国際安全保障論でありますとか、東アジアの地域主義でありますとか、そういうことをご専門に、日本のその発信力を支えているような研究者でもあります。では早速ですね、アーミテージさんにお話をお願いしたいと思いますが、その前に若干事務的なといいますか、ちょっと待ってください、今。通訳といいますか、これは同通を入れてますんで、言語が選択できるようになってるんですが、右下の方にですね、ボタンがあるかと思います。で、そこのボタンを押していただけると、オフと英語と日本語というふうになってるかと思うんですが、オフですと、この生のままのやり取りが聞ける。で、英語ですと英語の通訳で、日本語ですと日本語の通訳でということになってますんで、ぜひそれを活用していただければと思います。それから質問の方はですね、直接たくさんの方に参加していただいてるんで、直接質問していただくことが難しいと思いますので、チャットの方で、この質問していただいて、これも随時受け付けてますんで、その中から我々の方でこれ適宜選んで、この登壇者にぶつけていきたいというふうに考えております。では早速セッションに入りたいと思いますが、アーミテージ大使の方からよろしくお願いします。Ambassador Armitage, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Nakayama and Dr. Jimbo. Pleased to see you this morning, and good evening from Washington, D.C. I want to start off, as I did the last section, by showing my colors. I hope you can see that. It's KU. I'd like to tell you that's KU University. It's actually the University of Kentucky, but it's the closest thing I had to being able to show school spirit. So please take it in that vein. A couple of things to say about foreign policy in Asia, the Biden administration. First of all, we're only a week in to the Biden administration. We've got, I guess, 4 now of our cabinet officers who have been voted on, to include General Austin and Secretary Blinken. And I think we're off to a good start. because they've said the right things in their hearings about Asia and about Japan, more importantly to me. But one of the most important things, I think, that can be a guidepost for Japan moving forward on the Biden administration is something that President Biden said in his inaugural address. He said, the world doesn't need an example of our power, but maybe rather the power of our example. And I think that's a very powerful statement. So I think the first thing going forward that you'll see from the Biden administration is interest. You know, as I've said in other fora, there's nobody in the whole world that doesn't know what the United States thinks about X, Y, or Z. But I think many people want to know, do we understand what they think about X, Y, or Z? So I think the first thing you'll see from the Biden administration is perhaps a little silence while they listen to friends in Japan, to friends throughout Asia. And I think this will be very welcome, and it'll be a very good start for the Biden administration. Second, I think if you just look at recent U.S.-Japan history, for the last year and a half, we haven't had a U.S. ambassador, though we're very lucky to have an excellent chargé in Joe Young. Australia didn't have an ambassador for a couple of years. Korea didn't have an ambassador for a couple of years, and Singapore never had one. So the point I'm making is that the previous administration didn't show any interest, in my view, in doing the day-to-day harvesting that is so necessary for a good diplomatic harvest. So the second thing that you'll see, besides, I think, an ability to listen for a change from the Biden administration, will be we'll show up for a change. Our Secretary of State didn't bother going to the ASEAN Regional Forum for a couple of years. And I know with my previous boss, Secretary Powell, he never missed one because in diplomacy and in relationships between states, showing up is about half the game. It's as important in a way as what you have to say. Regarding U.S.-Japan relations, that I said previously, and I'll say it again, that Dr. Joe Nye and I have had the honor of presenting 5 different Nye Armitage reports. And just listening to the titles, I think, will tell you how far the relationship between the United States and Japan has gone. In the year 2000, we talked about advancing toward a mature partnership. Not clear about who was this partner and who was this partner down here. In 2007, we had our second report, talked about getting Asia right through 2020. Our third report in 2012 was anchoring stability in Asia. These were in recognition that Japan and the United States were going to have to deal in our own way and together sometimes with the rise of China. In 2018, we made the point that Japan was more important than ever. That was the title of the relationship or the paper. And that was directed strictly at the Trump administration. We weren't sure if they were seized with the importance of the U.S.-Japan relationship. And 2020, and this is very important, the title of our report, which Dr. Cooper assisted on mightily, was An Equal Alliance with a Global Agenda. The emphasis on 2 words, equal and global. And that's the way I think the Biden administration will see Japan. They certainly were welcoming of the Nye Armitage report. And I've got a feeling that the difficulties, as Dr. Denmark has alluded to in a previous session, for the United States to get our ship right, to get our ship in order, to get our budget in order, to get past the hangover of the Trump administration, to get past the divisiveness in our own country is going to take a lot of the strength of the Biden administration. It won't take it all, but I think it maybe makes true the statement I made about the United States having to take the necessary time to listen to our allies and to our friends. So I think we'll show up more, we'll listen more, and I think we'll be less inclined to have just a verbal policy, but actually try to back up whatever we say by actions, whether it happens to be in the trade front, because we're absent from the two major trading blocks, RCEP and CPTPP, whether it's to engage more fully with all of our allies in Asia. I think you'll see that as a hallmark of this new administration. So I'll stop there, Dr. Nakayama, and listen to my colleagues and to Dr. Jimbo.
アミテージ大使ありがとうございます。これからのその同盟の、方向性っていうのがこの平等でグローバルということで、ともすると日本はこのアメリカがどうこの対応してくれるんだっていうことばっかりこの読み解こうとしますけども、あれ平等でグローバルなこの同盟っていうことで言いますと、日本として何ができるかっていうことをもっとこのいわば自ら能動的に考えなければいけないというメッセージもあったかと思います。では続いてデンマークさんの方にお話をお願いしたいと思います。デンマークさんよろしくお願いします。
Thank you very much for having me. It's wonderful to see everybody. It's especially an honor to speak with my former Wilson Center colleague, Dr. Nakayama, to speak with Ambassador Armitage, my old friends, Dr. Cooper, Dr. Jimbo, and Aha Gozaimasu for everybody in the audience. Just a few points I wanted to make, adding on to what Ambassador Armitage already said. And first, I wanted to relate a quick reflection of a conference I was able to visit before it shut down. It was one of the largest conferences in Asia. Senior leaders from across the region, really from around the world, were there. And for 3 days, every panel, regardless of the topic, was talking about the problems with the United States. The United States is not engaged. The United States doesn't care about Asia. The United States isn't doing the right things on this issue, that issue. The decline of the United States, the rise of China is repeated throughout the conference. And at the end of the 3 days of this, the conference organizer asked these senior leaders, so what do we do about all this? And the answer was, we need the United States. That despite all of this, the United States still has there's still a lot of demand for American power and leadership in the region. I think for most countries in the region, whether they say it publicly or privately or not, I think the United States is still poised to lead in the region. But it's not automatic. It's going to take a lot of work for the United States to climb out of the hole that we've dug for ourselves, but also to remain engaged and to demonstrate that we can be reliable and effective in some difficult areas. So I wanted to talk about two areas two challenges I think the new administration is going to approach in the Indo-Pacific, is going to face in the Indo-Pacific, especially in East Asia. Clearly, these aren't the only issues, but I think some of the most pressing. The first is going to be North Korea. Now, while I'm sure that any administration coming in would want to have some time to get their house in order, to do a policy review, to get people nominated and confirmed. But the North Koreans have a tendency to demand attention and on their own time schedule. And over the last 4 years, despite all the symmetry and all the language that we've seen about a new era in the relationship, North Korea has developed new missiles, some of which many believe are capable of avoiding the missile defense capabilities of the United States and its allies, and has had time to build more nuclear weapons over the last 4 years. So North Korea is a more significant challenge than it was 4 years ago. And the downside, though, is that we've already been through all these efforts at engagement, that we've talked to the decider, we've talked to Kim Jong-un about these issues, and we haven't been able to change the path that we're on. So I think we're going to have to wrestle with the realities of the North Korea that we face. And it's going to pose some real significant challenges for us, both in terms of a political strategy, but also in terms of a military strategy. The other issue that I'd like to highlight, of course, is China. That most times with the new administration, the Chinese try to put things on a good on a good level. They try to keep things relatively quiet so that they can engage with the new U.S. administration, try to put things on a positive path. So far, the Chinese have not done that with Biden. We've had over 20 aircraft fly into Taiwan's ADIZ over the last few days. We've had more assertiveness from Chinese military forces in other parts of across China's periphery. And we've had, at the same time, Xi Jinping saying some very flowery language to the Europeans at Davos, talking about how the weak should not be bullied by the strong, which, as I said on Twitter, that the offer does not apply to Vietnam, Australia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and basically most other countries around the Indo-Pacific. But they're saying the things that a lot of people want to hear. But more importantly, this year will mark the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. It's also an important year for Xi Jinping's efforts to reestablish his leadership position and to build support amongst China's factions. And I think those are going to be very much influencing China's approach to international affairs, make them perhaps less flexible in certain ways. And the Biden administration is going to have to find a way to address this. In the past, and this is my opinion here, in the past, we've heard Americans talking about the need to find a balance between cooperation and competition with the Chinese. And I think that what we're going to see going forward is actually probably both increasing at the same time. That as we try to cooperate with the Chinese on issues of mutual interest, be it climate change, be it the international public health, at the same time, I think we'll see intensifying competition in technology, in security, and a wide variety of other international issues and international fora. So it's going to be an increasingly complex dynamic. But I think that what's changed significantly, and I think what's going to be critical for the United States to face, is accepting a degree of friction with the Chinese as necessary for doing business. And just because we're facing some friction in some areas does not mean that we can't cooperate with them in others. We've done it in the past, and I think we can do it in the future. And I think that's going to be the future of an increasingly complex and vital relationship between the United States and China. Clearly, there's a lot more to talk about our alliance, U.S. approach to alliances and partnerships more broadly, which is what my book is about that you mentioned, Toshi. But for the interest of time, I'll stop there. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。今、デンマークさんの方から、そのアジアにおいてやっぱりアメリカしっかりしてもらわないと困るっていうようなコメントをトランプ時代にもらったっていうエピソードを紹介いただきましたけども、この前の就任式ですね、1月20日の就任式を見ていて、我々過去4年間ずっとアメリカファーストっていうのを聞かされてきて、なんかアメリカはもうそういう普遍国家とか実験国家であることをもうやめちゃったっていう、もう無理なのかなっていうふうに我々は多く思ってたわけですけども、就任式を見て、なんかそのアメリカはまだ実験を続けるつもりがあるんだ、頑張ってもらわないと困るなっていうふうに久しぶりに思えたんで、そういう意味ではやっぱり日本でもやっぱりアメリカ立て直してしっかりしてもらわないと困るっていう気持ちが非常に強いんだろうと思います。では次にザック・クーパーさんにぜひお話をいただければと思います。ザックさん、クーパーさんよろしくお願いします。
Of course. Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you. And Professor Nakayama, I really appreciate you hosting this wonderful event. I want to just make 3 brief points about changes that are going on in Asia, and then 3 points about where I think U.S. policy is headed under the new administration. So the first point about where things are headed in Asia builds on what Abe just said. Look, the United States is pretty unpopular in Asia right now. In fact, if you look at polling data, there's less trust in the American president at the end of 2020 than there was in Xi Jinping, which is pretty remarkable, right? The good news here, however, is that this won't last for long. And I think when you start seeing polling data about Joe Biden come in, it will be incredibly popular. And I'll just give you the example of the comparison of George W. Bush, who I worked for at the end of his administration. If you look at polling data, about 35% of people in Japan were confident in George W. Bush when he left office in 2008. And if you look at the polling data from the middle of the Obama years, 66% of Japanese were confident in Obama. And now that number has dropped down to 25% in Donald Trump. So I think you'll see those numbers, not just in Japan, but elsewhere in the region, pop right back up for Joe Biden, which will give the team some momentum to run with, right? It will give them some new energy in Asia. And there's one other good piece of news here for the United States, which is that although Donald Trump wasn't very popular, Xi Jinping also wasn't popular, and Xi Jinping is going to stay in office for the foreseeable future. So there's no easy way for the Communist Party to shift this dialogue. Unfortunately, Xi Jinping has gotten rid of term limits, so he's going to be there, I would think, past 2022. And therefore, we're not likely to see the rapid change in popularity of China as we're going to see in the popularity of the United States in Asia and beyond. So in the US-China competition, this gives the United States a little bit of a leg up, at least over perhaps the next year or two. Now, what does this mean in Southeast Asia in particular, which I think is one of the centers of gravity of the competition? Unfortunately, there's a lot of work for the United States to do there. But just as Abe said before, if you look at polling data, the reality is that America is more important to Southeast Asia than ever before. Actually, Southeast Asians will say that they want American presence, right? So they want an engaged US. Even if they didn't love the Trump administration, they still think the United States is important on security issues, on economic issues, and even on some values issues as well. So there's a real desire for US engagement, but it has to be different than what the US did over the last 4 years. And so let me just offer 3 points about some of the differences that I think we'll see and some of the challenges, in fact, for the Biden team as they go into this new period. So the first challenge is just the fact that the United States has real domestic difficulties that it is trying to deal with right now. If you were to ask the Biden team what their top priorities are right now, I think the first answer would be the pandemic. The second answer would probably be the US economy and opening it back up. The third answer would probably be political polarization in the United States, right? We're going to go through an impeachment trial of our previous president in about 10 days here. So foreign policy is not at the top of the Biden team's agenda, which doesn't mean that they won't be paying a lot of attention to it, but just means that right off the bat, I think they're going to have to do a little bit of extra work to make sure that countries in Asia feel that the US is actively engaged in making these things a priority, because so much of what the Biden team has to do is focus back at home. And it's going to be hard to focus back at home and at the same time pivot back to Asia, if you will. The second thing that's going to be difficult is trade policy. And here, obviously, the United States withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We were never part of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And so the United States finds itself on the outside looking in, and it has to get back in the game. But the reality is that even if the Biden team wants to get back into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard, not because it doesn't make sense. It makes lots of strategic sense. It's going to be hard for political reasons. And this is a surprising one. Trade has not been more popular over the last few decades than it is today in the United States. And yet, in Washington, trade is not particularly popular in the US Congress. And so the hard part isn't getting the American people to support trade. It's getting the members of Congress and in the Senate in particular to actually vote for a trade agreement. And so even if the administration wants to re-enter the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it may be very difficult to actually execute that. And then the third challenge here is something that was an issue for the Obama administration, which is just resources. The United States can't do everything. It has tried very hard to do more with limited resources in Asia, but I think we're reaching the point where the United States is going to have to make some hard choices. It can't keep doing as much as it has done in the Middle East and in Europe and do more in Asia. And so unless we see increased defense spending, which I think is highly unlikely, you're going to be talking about some cuts to the defense budget. And at the same time as you see those cuts, the United States is going to have to convince its allies and partners that is really going to put more effort into Asia in particular. And that's going to be a tough sell, right? People in Washington often like to say that we need to do more with less. But if China's doing more with more, then more with less doesn't sound like a very appealing argument. So I think those are three real challenges for the Biden team. They're not challenges of the Biden team's making. These were challenges for the Trump team as well in some cases, but they're things that are going to be hard issues where there's no easy solution. I think the good news is that the Biden team is incredibly strong on foreign policy and on Asia in particular. If you're going to list all of the people on the Democratic side of the aisle that you would want in government, the only one at the moment that I can't think of who's going in at the moment is Abe Denmark. But just about everybody else on the list is taking a leading role, right? And that's really critical. The reality is we've had a couple of years under the Trump administration where we had a few good officials in important positions, but a lot of the rest of the government was basically unfilled or was filled with people who just weren't that experienced on East Asia and Southeast Asia in particular. And that won't be the case this time around. But as I said, they're going to have big challenges that won't be easy to overcome. So I think we're going to really have to watch closely to see if the Biden team can find some policies that can find the way through these difficult challenges over the next few years. So with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Professor. Thanks.
はい、ありがとうございます。いや、私もデンマークさんは多分このウェブナー忙しくて出れないんじゃないかなと思ってたんですけども、まあ友情関係を尊重して出ていただいて非常にありがたく思ってますし、それからぜひクーパーさんにもですね、このバイデン政権の超党派性っていうのを示すために政権に入ってもらいたいなっていう気もするんですけども、まあ、冗談はさておきですね、次に神保先生にお三方の話をまとめるというか踏まえてですね、何かそのコメントなり質問をいただければと思います。どうぞよろしくお願いします。
はい、中山先生、本日はお招きいただきましてありがとうございます。慶應義塾大学の神保です。もしよろしかったらですね、ディスカッションのために、英語を使って、質問をまずさせていただければと思います。お許しいただければと思います。So, I'm going to switch my language to English, and I'm very delighted to be joining this webinar, and my deep thanks to Ambassador Armitage for leading this program, which Keio faculty members and graduate students are very proud of. And I also like to thank Zack and Abe for joining today and offering a very insightful perspective on U.S. policy towards Asia under the Biden administration. And before getting into specific question, and I would like to mention, which has not been mentioned by speaker much, about the continuity aspects from Trump administration to Biden. Because despite the United States has been undergoing very difficult time, as we know, with having a deep divide in the society, and some of those divides, I think, are very fundamental. But there has been a constant bipartisan engagement, especially in the U.S.-Japan alliance and towards the Indo-Pacific region. And I would like to recognize the important leadership played by the NSC, some of the members of NSC, Joint Chiefs, Department of State, and also Defense, as well as active role of the U.S. Congress, which Zack has already mentioned, which have passed almost unanimously the numerous important bills and acts and initiatives, and that has been providing especially the financial platforms of the U.S. engagement in the region over past years. And I think that really shows that the fundamental strength of the United States physically engage in the region. And I think that should not be overlooked. And here, I'd like to quickly offer 3 quick questions for any of you can pick up to respond. And I know many of those audiences also like to respond, so I will be very brief. First is with regard to the COVID-19. And almost every government in the world now spending massive amount of money in dealing with the COVID, which eventually generate the enormous physical challenge for the government spending. And the huge difference between what we had in the Lehman shock back in 2008-9 was that we still have a booming stock market. But the challenge to the federal budget seems to become quite serious, especially for the Biden administration. So how much the United States, robustness of the Indo-Pacific engagement might be affected by the post-COVID fiscal challenges. And I think, Abe already mentioned about these aspects. But would there be a similar situation when the United States encounter such kind of like a fiscal cliff situation back in 2010s? And what would be the defense budget? Those are my first question. And my second question is with regard to the China policy. And I think many of audience today are wondering how the U.S.-China relationship would play out in the new administration. And I think those aspects have already been mentioned by the speakers. But numbers of observers emphasize that there will be a much continuity than drastic policy changes. In that, I will agree. In that aspect, I agree. But listening to Kurt Campbell's article at the Foreign Affairs, where he says that there has been a marginal buy-in from China has played a central role in the region's success thus far. And I believe that is also true for Japan. And Japan is also part of it, about the marginal buy-in status. So given that the Biden team respects the principle, but they are not the kind of zero-sum fighters for all front. And are there any kind of new types of the U.S.-China understanding over what Obama administration was trying to approach towards concept like a strategic reassurance and those kind of types of the policy will be materialized in the Biden administration. And my final question is with regard to the wider regional cooperation, especially focusing on the Quad and its plus. And I think a Quad, 4 countries, US, Japan, Australia, and India, cooperation development has been the fascinating, developments in terms of the creating the engine in the Indo-Pacific cooperation in many fronts. But I also think that the Quad has been important as a framework rather than actual operational aspects. And for example, Quad is not suitable for dealing with the specific challenges and the crisis response. So that the key regional player that come into play in dealing with everyday challenges are probably Korea, Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore, and Indonesia, and you can name it. And I think that those kind of specific tailored relationship will be very much important in dealing with everyday crisis and creation of the partnerships. So when Biden administration talking about it placed the importance on the alliance and partnerships, what kind of those allies and partners structure you will imagine will be emerging under the leadership of the Biden foreign policy teams? And I think those questions are also being raised by some of the audiences already. So Nakayama-san can, just to, skip my questions and, you can actually collect the general questions from the audiences. And those are from me. Thank you very much.
Well, those were too good of a question to skip. So I'll give you, not too long, but in a very concise way. Could you try to answer, Ken's question, any one of you, and then I'll give you the question from the floor. So we want to save time for the question from the floor. So please answer Ken's question in a very concise manner. Whoever wants to take the floor.
Dr. Nakayama, I can answer it in a very concise manner, I think. On the first question about COVID and money, et cetera, I think the Biden administration sees a direct relationship between money spent on COVID, economic improvement in the United States, employment, and infrastructure development. So, yeah, I think as Dr. Cooper has laid out, he had the priorities correct, but I think if the Biden administration sees them all as a straight line continuity. You can't just pick and choose one of those, and each one has a big effect on the other. Do we have a big deficit? Yes, like Japan. Can we get past it? Well, our economists are still saying so. So we'll see. The second was on U.S.-PRC relationship. The short word, I think, is the relationship we may enjoy is a rocky relationship. It's not a zero-sum game. And if I were to choose one thing that may change in the relatively near future, it's because of China's actions, and that is the ambiguous policy in the Taiwan Straits is being seen more and more in some areas of Capitol Hill is no longer serving our interest. Perhaps some removal of some of that ambiguity, at least the beginnings of it, might be warranted. But if I were to choose one thing that may happen in the short term, that would be it. On the third question of Dr. Jimbo, I thought it was very perceptive. I think the Quad it's good to have. I'm happy to have the 4 countries cooperating, but it's not a substitute for regional forum. It's not a substitute for the ARF. It's not a substitute for bilateral relationship. It's a nice to have, sometimes difficult to maintain relationship. It's better than to not have it, but it's not suited for diplomatic challenges and things of that nature. So that's my concise answer.
ありがとうございます。Zack, please.
I'll just add a quick comment and then hand it over to Abe. So I just want to build on what Ambassador Armitage said on the Quad. I think he's exactly right. You know, the Quad relationship has been easy in part because these were 4 countries with conservative leaders the last few years. And so politically, it was also easier for them to cooperate. Donald Trump wasn't going to complain a lot about nationalism in India, for example. It just wasn't in his nature. I think one challenge, though, for the Biden team is that they're going to be talking a lot about human rights issues and democracy issues, about universal values. And I actually am a big supporter of that. But I think it's going to make for a bit of a rocky relationship at times with the Indians, right? And so I think it's possible that the Quad could end up having a little tricky time the next few years, with the U.S. talking a bit more about these values issues on the one hand, and then on the other, I think some in the Biden administration believe that the Quad took up too much of the oxygen in Asia over the last 4 years, right? That we should have put a little bit more of that energy into the relationships that we have with Southeast Asian countries. And so I think it's going to be absolutely critical that Japan and Australia help the U.S. explain to India that talking a bit more about values and putting a little more time into Southeast Asia is not actually decreasing the U.S.-India relationship, right? But it's trying to enhance the regional framework that we have for the Quad relationship. Because it's not enough just for the Quad to be strong. The whole regional network needs to be strong. And it's those other areas which I think are going to take the most effort. Thanks.
Hey, please.
Yeah, just building on the comments of Ambassador Armitage and Dr. Cooper. First about spending a lot on COVID and other domestic priorities. If I were looking at the United States from Japan, and I wanted the United States to be an effective competitor against the United States, I would say that before you start looking at defense budgets, before you start investing in those sorts of expensive pieces, you need to get your house in order first. You need to get past COVID. You need to revitalize your economy. You need to invest more in innovation, in infrastructure, in education, the foundations of a robust economy. And I think that's what makes us competitive over the long term. So I think actually competition begins at home. And I don't think that these are separate ideas. The other point I mentioned on this is that a lot of what we can do in Asia is not wildly expensive, that there are some questions on defense budgets that we will need to tackle. But so much of what the United States could do in Asia in terms of more diplomats, greater attention, more international aid, more investments in infrastructure, and other pieces are relatively cheap. especially compared to aircraft carriers and F-22s, F-35. So I think there's a lot we can do in terms of our overall investment. And if you look at in the past, if you look at champions for investing in the State Department in Asia, a lot of those champions have been coming from the Pentagon. And there's a reason for that. And the last point I'd make, I'd say India is going to be very important. I think we need to see India not through the lens of the Quad, but bilaterally and in the region. I worked for Ash Carter, so I drank the Kool-Aid on India a long time ago. But the one point I would make in terms of caution is that if the United States is going to be reducing its presence in Afghanistan, if dynamics in Afghanistan with Pakistan are going to become more problematic, I fear that may start to sap some of the investment, attention, and energy that India may be having eastward and continue to drive it westward, which of course is why China continues to support Pakistan, is to sap that Indian attention and energy. I do think there's a lot more to discuss in terms of ASEAN and Southeast Asia, but I want to be sensitive to time, so I'll stop there.
もうこのままずっと言っちゃってもらいたいんですけども、神保先生のいい問題提起で、ただせっかくフロアからですね、参加者の方からいい質問もいろいろいただいてるんで、とりあえず神保先生がとのやり取りはここまでとさせていただいて、でもすでにいただいた質問の中で部分的にもう答えられてるのもあると思うんで、ちょっと私の方でピンポイントしながらいくつかの質問を今放り込みたいと思うんで、それに対して適宜皆さんピックアップして答えていただければと思います。まず一つ目はですね、これハドソン研究所の村野さんですかね、村野正史さんからのコメントですけども、英語で質問が来てるのでもう英語で読んじゃいます。When the Biden administration reviews its national security strategy and national defense strategy, what do you think is most different from 2017 NSS and 2018 NDS? Review, methods, priority, or approaches. So that's one question. And the second question. 二つ目は、この前、サキ大統領報道官が、例の戦略的忍耐ですね、strategic patience という言葉を使って、相当我々混乱してメディアもいろいろピックアップしたんですけども、あれはどういう意図だったのかっていうことですね。これが、2点目ですね。で、3点目としては、鎌田さんからの質問を部分的にちょっと答えていただいたんで、次の駒村先生からの質問に行きたいと思いますが、最近このナイ先生、ジョセフ・ナイ先生の書かれた本を読まれて、やはり依然としてアメリカにとってこのソフトパワーが大事だという議論をナイ先生が展開されているということなんですが、いろいろあるソフトパワーの中でも特に過去4年間のことを踏まえると、どういうソフトパワーをアメリカは見直す必要があるんだろうかっていう質問。それからですね。とりあえず、それからこれもあれかな。日本では意外にこのトランプ政権の評判というのが高かったりもするわけですけども、でそれは他の国とはかなり違う反応なんだと思いますが、でその裏返しとしてバイデン政権、非常にこの優秀な人たちが入ってるっていうのは今の説明もあったように我々は分かってるんですけども、でも本当にこの中国に対してこのタフになりうるんだろうかっていう疑念がどうしても日本はあると思うんですよね。でそういうこの日本の反応を見てどう思われるかっていう、今挙げた中からとりあえずピックアップしていただいて、短めにお答えいただけますか。でまだ時間があったらまたセカンドラウンドに行きたいと思います。どうぞよろしくお願いします。
Well, I might take a stab at a couple of them. Abe might want to try the defense strategy, national security strategy, or on the last question about China, can we be tough enough? I don't think there's an appreciation yet in Japan on how much the politics here in Washington have changed regarding China. There is almost nobody who will raise their hand and say we ought to be a little more gentle with China. almost all on Capitol Hill would put their hand up and say, yes, we need to be stronger, tougher, and declarative in our policies with China. Now, obviously, the Biden administration will be somewhat diplomatic, but that is a fact of life they have to deal with. It is also a fact of life, and John Kerry is right when he talks about all of us will be better off if we can get some cooperation on climate with China. All of us will be better off if we get some sort of health cooperation from China and pandemic and whatever else is coming down the way. So can we be tough enough on China? Yes. I think people might turn it around, however, and ask Japan. Look, it's easy for us to say that because, after all, we're not really in Asia. We're there as guests of the government of Japan at your bases in the Republic of Korea, but as a matter of fact, you are in Asia. So a policymaker in the United States would be justified to say, I've answered your question, now can you answer mine? Is Japan willing to be tough on China? It's a fair question. On Dr. Nye, on the soft power, Joe Nye and I, after he came out with his famous article about soft power, we chaired another CSIS study. And Joe will say, and in fact, we wrote it and said it was one of the biggest mistakes of his professional life to refer to soft power, because soft seems so weak and soft is so gentle, and diplomacy in the 21st century is rough and tumble. So we prefer now to use a term called smart power. And that's a combination of using your education systems, using your cultural prowess, using your values appreciation, whether it's democracy or human rights, in a way that's accepted and welcomed by host countries. That's a smart use of power, because you always fall back on hard power. So, and the question was, what sort of soft power do we have? We've got 12 of the top 20 universities in the world in the United States. That right there is a pretty good start on soft power. So,
Hey.
Thank you. To Murano-san's question on the national security strategy, national defense strategy, I haven't done the side-by-side comparison, but taking those and adding the recently declassified Indo-Pacific strategy that the Trump administration put out in the final days, in its final days, what strikes me is how divorced from the reality of the Trump administration's approach it was. That if you look at those documents, there was no mention of a trade war, no mention of needing to dramatically increase host nation support from our allies, no mention of engagement and placation with North Korea. So when I was in the Obama administration, I know a lot of people had their concerns, but one of the pluses that we had was that the strategies we put out were the president's strategies. He understood it and he followed it up. And I don't think we can say that for the Trump administration, unfortunately. So, when I saw the statements on free and open Indo-Pacific, I thought they were fine. I disagreed with parts of them here and there, but my main concern was that they weren't brought on by the president. And that to me is a major issue. In terms of the question on strategic patience from the White House press secretary, I noticed there was a bit of a Twitter kerfuffle about that when she used the term strategic patience. The press secretary is very informed. I think she does a fantastic job, but I don't think she knows the minutia of U.S. strategy towards North Korea. So I don't think there was a purposeful reflection of that term. And I think the White House later on clarified that this was not an intentional use of that term, but rather my understanding was that they're just a few days in on their administration, and to ask for some time for them to get their house in order in terms of some foreign policy pieces. And the last point on soft power that I want to make, building off of what Ambassador Armitage said, Dr. Cooper mentioned the polling saying that trust in the American president was at an all-time low in the region. And for the most part, that was true. But I think what I take heart in those polls is that they make a very clear distinction between trust in the American president, at that time President Trump, and trust in the United States, which was much higher, and actually far higher than any other country, including China, and I'd say especially China. Now, it's not universally true. I think the Philippines and India were big Trump fans, relatively speaking, but broadly, for the most part, there was a big bifurcation there. So I would say that while most of Asia did not trust President Trump, I still think that there is a lot of faith and interest and support for the United States more broadly. And that's something that I think we can build on.
Ambassador, I think you sort of had a two-finger sort of.
Just one point, and Zach, I think, will make a much more cogent point than I will. We have one problem in the U.S.-Japan relationship. We're talking about trusting each other, trusting the United States, trusting Japan, being equal partners and all. But even in the first couple of weeks, before Biden was sworn in and after, there are these folks, particularly in the Kantei, who are very inclined to parse every word that a press secretary or somebody says, whether we use the term free and open Indochina or a secure and free Asia, a Pacific rather, or whether we talk directly about Article 5 and use the word senkakus in the same sentence. The point is, all of our seniors aren't like Director Denmark, Dr. Cooper. They're not as informed about the ins and outs and the wheres and what alls of the relationship. So we got to have a little one time to have some patience, if I may, with senior government officials who are not as immersed in this as we are. And two, I have a little confidence in our relationship that somebody on either side can misspeak. It doesn't mean the relationship's coming apart. Sorry, Zach.
Well, I think that's such an important point because it's a strange world where we spent 4 years of the Trump administration where many of the president's supporters said, don't really listen to the words that he says, just kind of understand the general direction of his thinking. And now, there's sometimes panic about whether the administration said secure and prosperous instead of free and open. And I think it's just easy for us to get caught up in these little wording changes. At the end of the day, I agree with 100% with Ambassador Armitage that the instincts of this team are right. I think, as Abe said, yes, they agree with a more competitive strategy on China. The question is whether the Trump administration executed a particularly competitive strategy on China. And I'm not sure that they did. I think what was written down often made a lot of sense, but what was implemented did not. And, the president of the United States telling Xi Jinping to sort of go ahead in Hong Kong and do whatever he needed to take care of that problem. And, that Xinjiang and the Uyghurs weren't really a U.S. concern, that doesn't align with any of the strategy that the United States put out. So I think, as Abe said, realigning our strategy with our execution is going to be job number one for the Biden team. And I would just add one more comment, which some folks raised in the questions, which is that there are some areas where the U.S. and China are going to cooperate, and there should be, right? But I think in the past, the Chinese were very successful at saying, well, if you want us to cooperate on this issue, you've got to give in on these other sets of issues, right? Or at least you've got to be quiet about those disagreements. And I don't think we're in that world anymore. I mean, the fact that you had John Kerry today come out and very clearly say that if he makes a deal with the Chinese on climate change, that's a deal on climate change. It has nothing to do with other areas of the relationship, should be as reassuring as anything could be, because I know there are people worried about John Kerry and his role on climate change and whether it will bias the U.S. towards cooperation and not be competitive enough. But clearly the Biden team is worried about this and making clear that, yes, we're going to cooperate with China at times, but that doesn't mean that we can't compete in other areas as we need to. So that's just a quick comment. I mean, and just one last thing, if you will let me. I was scrolling through the list of people attending the meeting here, and it is a fantastic group of people, not just those who have asked questions, but also the rest of the attendees, so much expertise. So I wish we could actually get a chance to talk about all of their questions in detail, but that's just my 2 cents on the initial ones.
ありがとうございます。今の、やり取りっていうのは本当に重要で、我々、このちょっとした失言にこの過剰反応したりすることが非常に多いんですけども、やっぱりこのバイデン政権のこの基本認識はどの辺にあるのかっていうことをしっかり見届けた上で、いろいろ理解しておく必要があるのかなと思います。本当に今、クーパーさんがおっしゃったみたいに、非常にいい質問がたくさんあって、しかも我々がみんな親しい人たちの質問もたくさんあったりするんで、前取り上げてくれなかったじゃないかって後から怒られそうですけども、時間が若干押してるんで、最後にこれ毎日の古本さんからの質問で、日本は安倍政権の下で非常に安定した、そして戦略的なリーダーシップの下で外交的に存在感を示してきたわけですけども、その前の日本のそのリーダーシップってのは非常に危なかったわけですよね。で今、その菅政権が昨年発足して、今コロナ禍を中心になかなかこの対外的なプレゼンスを示すことっていうのが若干難しいような状況になっているかとも思うんですけども、ワシントンから見たときに今の日本のリーダーシップどう見えるのか、でどの辺に不安を感じるのか、もしくは可能性があるのか、その辺についてちょっと最後にですね、若干短めにお三方からお話を伺えればと思います。どうぞよろしくお願いします。
Well, I would say that obviously Americans don't choose the prime minister of Japan. Frankly, for a while, Japan was changing prime ministers like people change shirts. And that was certainly not the case for Abe Suridajin. And what Suga Suridajin does with his political future will be up to the people of Japan. But what we're interested in is the nation of Japan, the spirit, the innovativeness, the ability to generally, but not specifically in every case, share values. And we don't want a Japan that just listens carefully to the United States and then aligns their policy with us. I want a Japan, I think Abe and Zach would both agree, we want a Japan who, if they don't entirely agree with us, will say, we don't agree with you, and here's why. And maybe you, the United States, ought to change your policy.
ありがとうございます。Zach and Abe, do you have a word now?
How do you follow up with that? I think that's a terrific answer,
Right.
And I have absolutely nothing to add. I think that's a terrific answer.
ありがとうございます。いや、最後に日本に非常にこの重たい課題って言いますか、やっぱりその最初のお話じゃないですけども、やっぱりこの日米同盟をよりこのグローバルに、そしてこの対等なイコワルなものにしていくべきだということで、もちろん我々アメリカがどこに行くのか、どういうふうに考えているのかを理解することも大切ですけども、やはり日本としてのこの立ち位置といいますか、立場というものをきちんと、より固めていかなければいけないというこのメッセージなんだろうと思います。すいません、いろいろ非常にいい質問をいただきながらですね、私のこの采配が悪くて質問の方を十分にピックアップできませんでしたが、非常に今日お話を聞けたかと思います。新政権誕生後まだ1週間ですけども、今後のそのバイデン政権のこの方向性みたいなもの、それから観察していくときにどの辺をフォーカスしながら見ていけばいいのかっていう、そういうヒントをいろいろいただいたかと思います。お三方、アーミテージ大使、デンマークさん、クーパーさん、そしてコメントいただいた神保先生、それから参加いただいた皆様、本当にどうもありがとうございました。この様子はですね、KGRI、慶応のグローバルリサーチインスティテュートのホームページに近々アップしたいと思いますので、もしもう一度見たいということでありましたら、またそこを訪れていただければと思います。今日は本当にどうもありがとうございました。時間が来たんで、これでおしまいにしたいと思います。